Good afternoon, everyone. I am Erin Uritas, and I am the CEO of Out and Equal Workplace Advocates. It is my honor to welcome you to this special session today, the pandemic, the polls, and inclusion. Just a month ago, we had over 5,000 people attend our annual Workplace Summit, which has always been the largest conference for LGBTQ equality. And this year, of course, we were virtual. In early October, we were anxiously looking towards the November election, hearts in stomachs, and struggling to keep our hopes steady. So many of you were there at Summit, and we know that the annual NBC News panel is one of the highlights of that week. That's why we decided together to hold it after the election and give you this rare opportunity to hear firsthand what leaders in the movement see as a path forward. I am proud to be alongside my peers today, HRC, the Trevor Project, GLAAD, TAG Magazine, and Trans-Latin Coalition. These are the leaders who give their all every day to safeguard our equality and push for change. Today, we'll be having a conversation about the election, the pandemic, systemic racism, anti-trans violence, and more. It's poignant that we are having this right before Transgender Day of Remembrance. This movement is indebted to Black and Brown trans women. TDOR is not just a day of memory. It is a devastating reflection of how far we have to go, and we all must do more. I know that with leaders like those on this panel and so many of you tuning in, we can make 2021 a year for the history books for our collective equality. I am very thankful to Out and Equal's presenting sponsor, NBC News Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, for their work in putting this afternoon together for us. Out and Equal's mission is to help LGBTQ employees thrive and to help employers create workplaces of belonging where every individual can show up as their full, authentic self. And I can tell you from experience that NBC News is an organization that truly strives every day to fulfill this mission. I'm happy to call you our partners. I would now like to introduce Yvette Miley. Yvette is Senior Vice President of NBC Universal News Group. I'm proud to say she's also a board member of Out and Equal. Yvette, thank you for what you do day in and day out to help advance our shared mission.
Thank you so much, Erin, for the work you do and your leadership. Erin, you mentioned a phrase that resonates with me. I know it's the mission of Out and Equal. And the phrase you used was to create workplaces of belonging. I have worked at NBC for 30 years. And although we are not perfect, I can tell you that I came out at work before I came out at home. Why? Because I felt I belonged. As the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I have the title, but the job is not mine alone. We each play a pivotal role in creating a culture of belonging where we work. Today, we are here for an important discussion about the pandemic, the polls, and inclusion. MSNBC anchor Joshua Johnson will lead us in that discussion. But first, on the heels of an election, we thought you should first hear from our Chief Justice Correspondent, Pete Williams, and our SVP of News, Janelle Rodriguez.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Joining me is NBC News Senior Justice Correspondent Pete Williams, who is well known to many of us. And we have to start where the nation is right now. Everyone is obsessed with this question of the election. And Pete, the million-dollar question is, do you think the Supreme Court is going to have to weigh in on this one?
I really doubt it at this point. There's been a case sitting on the Supreme Court's doorstep now for several weeks, challenging a decision by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to extend the deadline for mail-in ballots by 3 extra days, allowing any mail-in ballots to be counted if they got in by Friday at 5 o'clock the day after the election. The challengers say only the legislature can make that kind of a rule change, not the state Supreme Court. Twice before, the U.S. Supreme Court has declined to fully embrace that theory. They didn't block the lower court order. Justice Alito said, well, you should keep those ballots separate, but he didn't say they can't be counted. And, you know, every day that goes by, the Supreme Court seems to show no interest in taking that case. So at this point, I think the chances the Supreme Court are going to get involved are extremely low. And so far in state courts in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, the Republicans or their backers or the Trump campaign have had very little success with their claims that there were irregularities in how mail-in ballots were treated.
So would you say, just for laymen out there, there's not enough strength in the cases going before the states to even make it to the Supreme Court? And even if one or two were, it probably not enough to be a tipping point. And even at that, the Supreme Court is very hesitant to recreate Florida 2000. Is that a good layman's assessment here?
Well, absolutely right. And remember, Bush v. Gore in 2000, the initial difference in the count was like 500 votes. So the case was cataclysmic. It was monumental. There's nothing like that kind of margin, what the lawyers call the margin of litigation, to make these lawsuits, even if they were successful, change the outcome.
Well, and it seems almost like decades ago, the way this news cycle is going, but we are just not far past the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett, you know, that went through right before the election. What do you think, aside from the short-term implications, what do you think the long-term implications of that shift in the court is going to be?
Well, I think we may see one pretty soon. We'll talk about it a little bit later, about one of the important LGBT cases before the court. But I know you want to ask about that one, so we'll come back to it. But I think in general, a lot of issues that the Supreme Court has been reluctant to tackle, it may now take up. I'd be surprised if in the next year or so, the Supreme Court does not visit the issue of the Second Amendment and the right to have a gun outside the home. The Supreme Court's only ruling in 2008 was that the Second Amendment provides an individual right to have a gun at home for self-defense. But there have been a lot of cases that say, well, you know, the Second Amendment says keep and bear arms. Surely that must mean more than having the gun locked in your nightstand. So the Supreme Court has been reluctant to take that case. And I think because the Second Amendment advocates on the court were never quite sure whether they had 5 votes, now I bet they do. And I'd be surprised if the court doesn't go there. I think affirmative action, maybe on life support in school admissions. We just had a case involving Harvard. They won their case in the Court of Appeals, but that will surely be appealed to the Supreme Court. And I think, you know, without Justice Kennedy, without Justice Ginsburg, this court's going to take a much dimmer view of affirmative action.
Yeah, and you referenced Fulton versus the city of Philadelphia. Can you just encapsulate what that case is about and what the potential implications are?
Yeah, so this case could be a really big deal or maybe only a small deal. But I think the background here is, since the Supreme Court in the Obergefell decision said that there is a constitutional right to same-sex marriage, there's been a lot of pushback from religious groups who say, you know, somebody should not, for religious reasons, have to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding, provide the flowers, do the wedding invitations, or whatever. And so this case kind of falls into that category. It's basically the laws against discrimination versus freedom of religion. It comes from Philadelphia, where a story showed up in the paper that said a couple of the firms that, or a couple of the charities rather, that contract with the city to provide foster homes for children would not place children in the homes of same-sex parents. So the city said to a couple of these charities, including Catholic Social Services, is that true? Would you not do that? And Catholic Social Services said, that's right, we can't do that. That would violate our religious beliefs that marriage exists only between a man and a woman. So the city canceled the contract for providing those services, and the Catholic Social Services sued. They said it's a violation of their freedom of religion. Now, that's the background of the case. The case was just heard by the justices. And there's one thing about this case that makes it a little complicated, and that is this. This is not the city regulating a group and saying, you can't do this with your charity. This is a charity contracting with the city. And what the city said is, hey, you're doing our work, so you have to abide by our laws. We're not saying anything about your practices. You can believe whatever you want about marriage, but when you're working for us, then you have to follow our laws. I don't know whether that's going to prevail or not. That was the city's theory about how this case would be different. My sense is that the justices want to find some way to accommodate religious freedom, and so that it isn't an either or thing. However, I don't think this case is going to go to the cataclysmic level that it could have gone, which is to say that freedom of religion always trumps discrimination. I don't think they're going to go that far. There was an invitation for them to do that. I'd be surprised if they did that. So my guess is this will be a limited loss for the city, a limited win for Catholic Social Services that will not, I think, based on how the argument went, have really wide repercussions.
And so would this be comparable to state or federal government saying, we're not going to fund family planning services that provide abortions?
It raises some of those same issues. So the Supreme Court several years ago said there is no religious freedom exception to a law that's generally applicable. And the Catholic Social Services lawyers invited the Supreme Court to overrule that decision. That's what I think the Supreme Court is not going to do. And that's why I think that the application here may be limited.
So I'm a mom of an adopted child myself and take keen interest in this case. So for all the parents or wannabe parents out there, is there something particularly to be worried about, I would say, in terms of the right to foster, the right to adopt for same-sex couples?
Potentially, yes, depending on how broadly the Supreme Court makes this decision. What makes this case kind of strange is not only the contracting aspect, but the fact that no same-sex couple was ever turned down by Catholic Social Services for the simple reason that I think they never came together in the first place. So, this is unlike the Masterpiece Cake case where the couple actually asked Jack Phillips to bake them a cake and he refused. But it may be like it in the sense that the Supreme Court finds some very narrow way to rule that makes the religious freedom community happy.
And so the last time we were here at this time last year, we were talking about a couple cases in front of the court that really hinged on whether you could be fired for being gay, lesbian, transgender, and the issue rested on the definition of sex. Walk us through what the ruling ended up being in that case and what that says in terms of the future of employment rights.
Well, it was a huge case. This was the Bostock case, a man in Georgia who was fired from the county when the county discovered he was on a gay softball league. He sued and the lower court said, well, sorry, there's nothing in the law about being fired for same-sex, there's no protection for that. So the question was, did the 1964 Civil Rights Act say, which bans discrimination based on a number of factors, including because of sex, does that apply to sexual orientation and transgender? And the Supreme Court said yes, in an opinion surprisingly written by Neil Gorsuch, who said, look, I'm a strict constructionist. I view statutes the way you're written. I don't see how you can say that firing somebody because they're gay or transgender is not discriminating on the basis of sex. Now, it was a 6-3 ruling. And that's important because even if that case, I think, had come back this year without Justice Ginsburg, but with Amy Coney Barrett, it would still prevail. It would be a 5-4 ruling, but instead of a 6-3 ruling, but there's still 5 votes for that proposition. So it really did change the landscape. firing somebody because they were gay or transgender was illegal in 21 states, but now that's nationwide, and you're already seeing lower courts cite this case in job discrimination cases.
So does it seem to you that this is binding going forward in terms of this is the law of the land and people can rest assured there is employment protection?
No question about it. And I also think that, we just talked about the Fulton case and the Supreme Court sort of wanting to give something to the religious community. I think this case is part of the reason for that sort of inertia of the court wanting to do that for the religious community. Probably a little bit of a rebound, if you will, from the Bostock ruling.
So we heard during the election some talk of expanding the Supreme Court. From your point of view, how realistic is that? And can you set it in its historical context?
So ask me again how realistic it is after the Georgia runoff elections, and we know whether the Republicans or Democrats are going to control the Senate, because it would take Congress to change the size of the Supreme Court. It was originally 6 justices, and for much of our early history, the size of the Supreme Court was based on the fact that Supreme Court justices were expected to ride the circuit and handle cases in the circuit courts as well. So as the number of circuits expanded, the Supreme Court expanded. At one point, it was even 10 justices. But it's been 9 justices since 1869. The number is fixed. It's no longer tied to circuits. And, even Justice Ginsburg said she thought 9 was a good number. So it would take both houses of Congress to approve. I think if you wanted to bet that this would happen, it's a losing bet. I'd be very surprised, even if the Democrats do control the Senate. And Joe Biden himself has kind of poured cold water on it by doing that thing that is always kind of a death knell. He wants a commission to study it.
Right. Where good ideas go nowhere fast. Let's talk through the Affordable Care Act, because that affects just about every American in terms of access and the economics of healthcare. Where does this go this year?
Well, this was a challenge brought by a bunch of red states who kind of engineered this thing with the Republicans when they had a majority in the Congress. So remember back to the first case after Obamacare was signed by the president. A couple of years later, some challengers said, hey, this is unconstitutional. There's this individual mandate that requires everybody to get health insurance. Congress can't require you to go out and buy something any more than it could say everybody has to go buy broccoli. So what the Supreme Court said is, well, actually, it is constitutional for this reason. It's a choice. It gives you a choice. You either buy health insurance or you pay a penalty on your taxes. So in other words, it saved it as a legitimate use of Congress's taxing power. So the Republicans came along and said, aha, we'll set the tax at 0. There goes your tax defense. And 18 red states went to federal court in Texas. And on that basis, the court agreed with them. The appeals court agreed with them too, saying, well, without the tax, all you have is the mandate, and therefore it's unconstitutional. Now, the defenders, a bunch of blue states, say, well, no, with no tax, there is no mandate. You don't have to do anything. You have a choice, get assurance or don't. There was a lot of concern by the Democrats during her confirmation hearing that Amy Coney Barrett was a guided missile aimed at the Affordable Care Act. But I think it's very unlikely the Affordable Care Act is going to be struck down for this reason. Even if the court says these states that are suing have the legal standing, and that's a real question. If you don't have to buy the insurance, what's your problem? How do you get to sue? 2, even if the court says it is unconstitutional without the mandate, then 3, you get to the big question, which is, okay, can the mandate be surgically removed and leaving the rest of the law intact? And on that, I think there's 6, maybe even 7 votes that the answer to that question is yes. And, the 3 liberals will certainly say that. So will the Chief Justice, it seemed. So will Brett Kavanaugh, who last year wrote a couple of opinions in unrelated cases saying, you know what, the Supreme Court's default position should be if a part of a statute is invalid, we're not going to strike the whole thing down unless we have a clear expression that that's what Congress wants us to do. And he said, look what happened in 2017. They took the tax out. period. They left the rest of the law intact. So for that reason, I think even if they answer yes, the states have standing, yes, it's unconstitutional, that part, the mandate, they'll leave the rest of it intact.
And you mentioned Amy Coney Barrett again. Is, people, I think, would like to think they know how she will vote on particular issues. Are there any areas just in general or specifically where you think she might surprise either her supporters or her detractors?
It's too soon to tell. She's asked, she's been, she didn't take part in any of the election cases that were piling up in the Supreme Court, these emergency applications to do various things about voting. She could have jumped in, but she didn't. She simply said through the court spokesman that she had just gotten there. She's unpacking. She hasn't had time to read the briefs or jump in. Now she could have. I think it's interesting that she did not go in with, big boots stomping around trying to exercise her power, which she could have done. But now, since the Supreme Court's oral argument started the first Monday in October, she's been a participant like any of the rest of them. But for example, during the Affordable Care Act or during the Philadelphia Charities case, it was very hard to tell where she was coming from based on her questions. She's being very, very careful in that sense.
So if you were, inevitably at the end of this year, and we do our top 10 of 2020 pieces, of which there will be many, many things to write about this year. What do you think, if you were going to sit down and write that script today, what is the defining story of 2020 as it relates to the Supreme Court?
Oh, it's the death of Justice Ginsburg, without a question, because her departure from the court and her replacement by a conservative appointed by President Trump makes this a solidly conservative 6-3 court. I think what we're going to see is a sort of similar pattern that we saw after Justice Kavanaugh came on the court, where you had this bruising confirmation hearing with very raw feelings and the court kind of pulling back and not wanting to do anything too radical and kind of a, not quite screensaver mode, but moving very incrementally and slowly. And I would guess that they're going to do something like that this term. So you're not going to really feel the full effect of this newly conservative court now for the next term or so. But make no mistake, it's certainly headed in that direction. Now, does that mean, by the way, that they're going to repeal same-sex marriage or repeal Bostock? No, I don't think so. But it does mean in a lot of these other areas, like freedom of religion versus laws against discrimination, you'll see a sort of new direction for the court.
Well, you led me right into actually what my next question was going to be, which is anecdotally, I've had a lot of friends who are asking me, although I always refer them to you, is this going to be the end of same-sex marriage? Will the Supreme Court somehow weigh in here? If I understand the way you're framing it, it's going to be less about that specifically and more about opening the door to discrimination under the guise of religious freedom. Is that the way you see the tensions?
I do. I think there are certainly 2 votes to overturn Obergefell tomorrow if they could, and that would be Thomas and Alito. And Justice Alito just last week made a speech at the Federalist Society where he sort of repeated with gusto what he had said in a dissent a couple of months ago about Obergefell and how he thought it was a bad idea. So there's 2, maybe even 3 votes to overturn Obergefell, but I don't think there's 5, and that's what it would take. We're going to see what the court does with abortion. Again, I don't think it's going to overturn Roe v. Wade, but I think it's a certainty that you'll see more restrictions, state restrictions on abortion upheld.
So is it, as it relates to abortion, a death by 1,000 cuts, so to speak, as it relates to the law and women's access to healthcare in that sense? Yeah,
without question. I'd just be very surprised if it doesn't go in that direction. And of course, as everybody knows, I suppose it just should be said for the sake of saying it, that even if the Supreme Court were to overturn Roe v. Wade, it wouldn't make abortion illegal. It would simply say that if a state wants to ban it, it can. And of course, many states would not, but some would. And that would make it extremely difficult for women in those states to get that care.
And so fast forwarding now to December of 2021, although I think we're all having a hard time to imagine, the crystal ball gets a little bit fuzzy. Is there a vaccine or no vaccine? Are we walking around with masks or not, but if you were to fast forward to December 21 and you're writing that year-ender piece, what do you think some of the big headlines either will be or we should be looking out for?
Well, for starters, I hope it's the Supreme Court coming back into the courtroom. You know, they stopped hearing oral argument in their marble courtroom in March. And, you know, we've not been able to get into the building. We cannot go into the Supreme Court building at all. And oral argument since then has been telephone conference calls, which makes it very strange, a little bit difficult to tell where the court is headed because everybody basically gets 3 minutes to ask a question and then they move on, or 5 minutes or whatever it is. So that's, I would think that's going to be one change. And by the way, you know, for a new justice coming to the court that doesn't have all that kind of interaction, I think it's going to be a strange start for Amy Coney Barrett because, you know, Justice Breyer, I don't know that he's even been around here much. He's spending a lot of his time at home in Massachusetts. So I think that will be one big change. You know, I think the Affordable Care Act, as I said, will be passed. We'll see some kind of accommodation to freedom of religion. This is a very pro First Amendment court in both senses, both in what we normally think of as free expression and secondly, freedom of religion. So I think that's where you're going to see a lot of movement in this Supreme Court.
All right, Pete Williams, as always, thank you very much. And for those of us watching, up next, Joshua Johnson.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you very much. Glad to be with you after those dulcet tones from the NBC television network. Thank you to Janelle Rodriguez and to Pete Williams for that fantastic conversation. I'm Joshua Johnson from NBC News and MSNBC, obnoxiously proud to be part of an organization that allows me to take part in an event like this. Thank you for making time out of your day for that conversation and for this one about an array of issues that we think are important to discuss as we make our way into a new year, a new administration, a new era. If 2020 has felt like anything, it's felt like a new frontier, and we might as well explore this frontier together with some people who are on the front lines of answering some of the big questions as it relates to LGBTQIA people. We have a ton to talk about and some fabulous guests to discuss it with. We've obviously talked about the Supreme Court. We have a new administration coming in. We've got COVID-19 that continues to be a plague on the nation, not just a pandemic, but particularly affecting some parts of the LGBTQIA communities. We'll discuss that as well. You'll have questions that you want to ask, and we would like to get them answered. But first of all, let me just make sure that everybody can see me and hear me. Yes? Am I audible? Excellent. Nothing worse than starting the program like this and thinking I'm saying something worthwhile. Not that I've never done that before, but I've done that before. Let's introduce the panel and then we'll dive in with questions. I'll go to you watching for your questions in about 20, 30 minutes. I'll open it up. If you start having good questions right away, please feel free to send them in and we'll start to work our way through questions in due course. But first, let me introduce you to the folks that we have with us. Amit Paley is the CEO and executive director of the Trevor Project. It's the world's largest suicide prevention and crisis intervention organization for LGBTQ youth. He began as a counselor on the Trevor Project's 24/7 Trevor Lifeline in 2011. Since then, he has answered hundreds of calls from LGBTQ youth in distress. Amit, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Also with us is Eben A. Bell, the founder and editor-in-chief of Tag Magazine and Tag Communication LLC. This year, Tag Magazine celebrates 8 years of telling thousands of stories and creating safe spaces for queer women and providing important resources for the LGBTQ community. Eben A., welcome.
Thank you.
Sarah Kate Ellis is the president and CEO of GLAAD, an organization she's run since 2014. She's expanded the group's mission by launching advocacy work beyond the news media, beyond entertainment media, to include global businesses, social media, video games, sports, and many other drivers of culture. Sarah, good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Alfonso David is the president of HRC, the Human Rights Campaign. He's an accomplished and nationally recognized LGBTQ civil rights lawyer and advocate. He is the first civil rights lawyer, the first Black man, and the first person of color to serve as HRC's president in its 40-year history. Mr. President, good to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Bambi Salcedo is the president and CEO of the Trans Latina Coalition, a national organization that focuses on addressing the issues of transgender Latinas in the US. Bambi developed the Center for Violence Prevention and Transgender Wellness, which is a multi-purpose, multi-service space for trans people in LA. Bambi, good to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
And of course, you've met Aaron Uritis, the CEO of Out and Equal, the world's premier organization working exclusively on LGBTQ workplace equality. Aaron first got to know Out and Equal in the early 2000s when she was working for Booz Allen, then went on to join Out and Equal's board of directors, co-founded the Out and Equal DC chapter affiliate, and served as co-chair for its summit in 2007. Aaron became Out and Equal's CEO in 2018. Aaron, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Joshua.
Although I'm welcoming you to your program, but you know, I welcomed everybody else, so you get to
Great to be here.
Good, great to be here with you as well. And again, please, those of you watching wherever you are on Zoom, first of all, thank you for taking time out of your day. We know there are 1,000 things you could be doing, especially with everything going on. So I think I speak for everyone when I say we all really, really appreciate you making time for this conversation. We'll make as much time as we can for your questions shortly. So keep a notepad or your notes app open. But first, we want to start by talking about politics. And Sarah Kate, let me start with you. I wonder what you heard from LGBTQ voters in terms of how they engaged with voting this year. There was a poll that GLAAD conducted last month that showed that 88% of respondents were registered voters, identified as LGBTQ. 74% of them said they would support Joe Biden, who went on to be the president-elect. Our NBC News exit poll showed that 7% of all of our poll respondents self-identified as LGBTQ, and they voted mostly for Joe Biden, 61-28. Sarah, what did you learn in terms of how LGBTQ people engaged with this election, particularly the two main presidential candidates?
Yes. Well, thanks for having me. And I think, you know, when we are about to release a poll that we just did that looks at over 800 LGBTQ people and exactly how they voted if they were registered. And so out of those 88% of registered LGBTQ voters, 93% of them voted. And overwhelmingly voted for Biden, overwhelmingly. So I'm not releasing those numbers just yet. I think what's also interesting is about these numbers is what drove them. What drove them, and their number one reason was for COVID-19. A third of them have lost their jobs or their jobs have been dwindled away because of COVID-19. A third of them are dealing personally, either with family members or friends who have contracted COVID-19. So a big impact on them was COVID-19. The second reason that drove them to the polls was healthcare. I think we were just talked about the Affordable Care Act. Healthcare is incredible to our community, incredibly important. And then the third reason that drove them to the polls was racial justice. And so you can see where the head and the heart of our community is and why they were going and showing up in a surge this year. 25% of those 93% that voted, that were registered, were first-time voters. So you can see we were motivated and we showed up at the polls and we showed up for our community at the polls. And one of the biggest drivers being COVID-19. I think what's also really interesting to note in all of this is that when you look at the LGBTQ community, what you started with was 88% are registered, who are eligible, are registered to vote. Back in January, that was 80%. So we saw that move 8 percentage points in a short period of time because of being so motivated to get to the polls. And one of the extremely concerning, or what they're most stressed about, is something that we talked about earlier, which is the Supreme Court and what's going on with the Supreme Court, and are their rights in jeopardy. So I think that there's a lot going on with our community and a lot of reasons that they showed up at the polls this year.
Alfonso David, you worked with the steering committee, the LGBTQ steering committee for the Biden campaign. Both campaigns had outreach efforts to LGBTQIA people. Both attempted to capture LGBTQIA voters. HRC endorsed Joe Biden over President Trump. What was that like in terms of being on the steering committee, Alfonso, particularly how much you feel you were able to help develop and steer policy during the election?
Well, first, thank you. Thank you for having me. Yes, we did participate on the Biden steering committee, and that work was incredibly impactful because we were working to make sure we mobilize voters all over the country. And we were making sure that we also address the misinformation that we're seeing on social media and that we see coming from anti-equality candidates all over the country. So you're right, we did endorse Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and the majority of LGBTQ people we know voted for Biden and Harris, and they also voted down ballot races as well. And that was all as a result of our work. We identified 57 million equality voters throughout the country. This is based on an analysis that the Human Rights Campaign did over the past several years, where we identified people who are predisposed to support pro-equality candidates and vote for equality at the ballot box. And we're seeing those numbers increase. We have 57 million equality voters throughout this country. 10 million of them live in what we call the swing states. And we know that they're voting like never before. We also endorse more than 650 candidates, which is more than we ever have in our 40-year history. 35% of them were people of color. 53% of them were women. 11% of them were LGBTQ. As we worked with the Biden campaign in identifying the obstacles, in identifying the misinformation, I think we were hugely successful because we had a huge turnout. We have more people voting in this election than any other election in history, other than, I think, 1900 is what we're saying. We have more people voting now than ever before. So working with the Biden-Harris campaign and really helping them identify some of these obstacles, educating voters, combating the misinformation was, I think, a huge factor in getting people to engage in this year's election.
Now, let me go from there, particularly to Bambi, who I wanted to talk to following that, because during the primary, Bambi, as I understand it, you endorsed Senator Elizabeth Warren and then served on Joe Biden's LGBTQ steering committee alongside Alfonso David. Talk about that a bit, particularly this kind of push to get Biden's policies to be more progressive that maybe Elizabeth Warren was more vocal about. Not necessarily that he opposes them, but I know that some have tried to push Joe Biden's team to adopt certain policies that they were not as vocal about as Elizabeth Warren was.
Yes, so I think, it's important for us to recognize, obviously, and I do want to appreciate and the great work that HRC and GLAAD has done to get some statistics specifically about the broader LGBTQ community. However, I think it's important for us to recognize and acknowledge that trans people was also part of all of this, right? And trans people has been part of multiple movements, right? And what is unfortunate about is that, trans people, the majority of trans people don't necessarily have access to exercise the right to vote, right? Nonetheless, we participate in whatever way possible. For instance, myself, right? I am not able to vote, but I am able to influence people, right? And I'm able to mobilize people, and many members of our community do the same. And I think, I'm so grateful that, the work that we do specifically is to uplift and bring up the issues that we as a community continue to experience within our society, right? And again, many trans people are not able to vote for different reasons. And one of those reasons is, the discrimination that we face, even while trying to go to exercise our right to vote, right? And so all of those things deter people to participate in voting. However, again, I think it's important that we recognize that, trans people are involved in multiple levels, to ensure that, we elect people into office as well, right? I'm part of two groups that one is a local group that is called Honor PAC, which is a political action committee to endorse LGBTQ Latinx individuals here across the state of California. But also I'm part of Trans United, which is also a PAC, right, that supports and endorses, candidates. And obviously we have a couple of wins, selecting candidates that are trans identified in the last at least couple of years, for sure.
Before I move on, Bambi, can I just follow up with you? You said that there's certain kinds of discrimination that trans people face when trying to exercise their voting rights. For those who may not have thought that through, can you give an example of what that might look like?
Yes, of course. I think, within our society, there's still a lot of a stigma and that has been created against our community. And, when many of us, again, go to the polls or try to go to the polls, I mean, even a look, right? Even, people chit chat among themselves when they see us on the lines, for instance, or, they do different things to make us feel uncomfortable. And many of us don't want to experience that, right? So because of that, one of those reasons, we just rather not to deal with that.
Aaron Uritis, let me ask you about the outgoing administration's policies towards the LGBTQ community. We've seen a great deal over the past 4 years as it relates to LGBTQIA people and the Trump administration. And then we've seen a lot as it relates to the private sector. Both have had an impact. Would you compare and contrast those two impacts for us, Aaron, how they might have been the same in some ways and how they might have differed?
Listen, so, and first I want to also thank you all for being on. We're really proud to host this, and thanks to you, Joshua. This has been really at the core of our mission at Out and Equal we're coming up on 25 years now. We've been partnering with and supporting primarily Fortune 1000 companies, medium-sized companies and government agencies throughout the years to fortify their efforts towards diversity and inclusion. And what we've seen is, steady progress there. I think, particularly leading up to this election, for the last several years, as we all know, the onslaught of attacks, negativity, attempted and realized legislation at the city, state, federal level has been overwhelming. And I think that while we as LGBTQ individuals and allies have been ongoing, catching our breath, the business community has stood up in many ways and been with there, in particular in the last several years, because it's good for business. And I think we'll talk a little bit about that more with the Supreme Court. But this is the long game for us. I mean, we've been supporting businesses and implementing real change despite whatever kind of administration or political moves happen. And for us, we've told our stories, we've made the cases for equality and to give us a fair chance at equity in the workplace. And I think that really has come to a head this year in multiple ways. I think when this administration has made some big moves against the trans community and healthcare, and certainly recently I would call the last gasp. One of the last gaps, at least, of attempting to silence diversity and inclusion by forbidding D&I training in agencies. I was getting I was getting panicked phone calls the week before our summit from federal employees who were afraid to come to our summit. So that was real, and I think it had the intended effect. I think again, the business community has been there and held a steady state, and many cases improved. When we started 25 years ago, I think 4% of Fortune 500 companies had any LGBTQ protections, and we've really seen a lot of progress there.
Erin, I just want to clarify a little something you said in terms of being afraid to come to diversity and inclusion training. There were, and I think this is what you're referring to, there were some directives that came down, as top of mind for me is from the US Department of Education, that said that if you want to receive, say, funding from us, or if employees want to be able to go to training, they can't include certain conversations about, for example, race, implicit bias, systemic racism, that they were making editorial choices on a federal level in terms of what was allowed in those conversations, particularly as it affected, say, universities that receive funding from the Department of Education, and all of a sudden they began to feel the pinch in terms of what they were allowed to say. That's one example of how this manifested. Is there something else that you saw, or is that kind of
more broadly than education? I think the executive order coming out of OPM for all government agencies not being able to host D&I training, diversity and inclusion training, where there were certain terms that may be mentioned. Intersectionality being one of them, which is kind of unbelievable if you think about it. And also the attempt through that executive order of influencing government contractors. So if you think about the scope of that and what that was attempting to do, hopefully, of course, we hope that this will be reversed almost immediately. But I mean, really broad, again, I think a last gasp, but that put a lot of fear into federal employees, that they not only could not host within federal agencies D&I training, but they could not attend external trainings without fear for their jobs.
Before I keep going, and Amit, I'm going to come to you in a second, but Sarah Kate, you wanted to jump in briefly. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Erin was saying, which is that, even at the World Economic Forum, where all the power players of corporate convene, they were taking the mantle for the past 4 years on human rights globally, and in America and globally on LGBTQ rights. And they really stepped into the place, and through many private conversations, and some very overtly, CEOs of the major companies have said outright that they feel that the current administration has left human rights by the wayside, both in the United States itself and globally, and that they feel tasked with taking that on. And there's a study by Edelman that they do every year on trust. They call it the Trust Barometer. And when you look at the Trust Barometer year over year, what continues to grow is employees entrust their employers, this is in the United States, more than they trust their government. And so CEOs and the C-suite sees this and sees the responsibility. It is good for business. I agree, Erin, and there are many white sheets on that. But there's also this other drive that companies, organizations are taking on a bigger role in society because they're being called to do that.
Amit and Ebony, I kind of want to talk about what you have seen in terms of the work that you do and the communities that you speak to, particularly with the pandemic and with the election. Amit, with the Trevor Project, I'm interested in, so far as you can discuss it. And I understand there are certain things that would be inappropriate to share, but insofar as you can, what the kinds of conversations have been that young people have had with Trevor Project this year as a result of the pandemic and the presidential election. I'd like to hear from you. And then Ebony, I'm interested in how those conversations have gone between your publication and its audience, the kinds of things that they want to engage on. Amit?
First of all, I want to say thank you so much for having me, and great to be with such esteemed colleagues. This has been a very difficult year for LGBTQ young people. There have been multiple crises that young people, especially LGBTQ young people, have been experiencing. I'll start first with the pandemic. The pandemic had a profound impact on LGBTQ young people. If you think about so many LGBTQ young people, let's talk about K-12 students. They might have that one supportive guidance counselor at school, or that friend, or that GSA that they turn to. And when this pandemic started and they were cut off for that, they were stuck with families that might be unsupportive, unaffirming, even emotionally or physically abusive, or even ones that would not allow them to stay in their home. If we think about college students, how many college students come out for the first time when they get to campus? And then when this pandemic hit, they suddenly had to go back home without much warning, and they had to make a terrible decision. Were they going to come out to their families when they might not be ready to do so, or were they going to go back into the closet? And so we hear every day on our lifelines, on phone, text, and chat, from young people who have been struggling with the impact of this pandemic on their ability to express who they are and to feel safe about who they are. Then, of course, we have the crisis of systemic racism and the violence against Black Americans. We've put out some polling that has shown that has had a very dramatic impact on Black LGBTQ youth and their mental health. But actually, our polling has shown that seeing those images of violence against Black Americans also has an impact on all LGBTQ young people. Seeing marginalized people being subjected to discrimination and violence impacts other marginalized people as well. And then when we think about the election, I mean, there's been such intense emotions around this election, and people talking about civil rights. I mean, the identities of many LGBTQ young people, especially LGBTQ young people of color, and especially transgender and non-binary young people. We have politicians who are talking about human beings, about young people, about kids, as if their rights, as if their identity, as if their dignity is a subject of debate when it should not be. Our research has shown that 86% of LGBTQ young people said the recent political climate had a negative impact on their well-being. Because these policies that are being discussed, the policies themselves can have a negative impact on LGBTQ youth. But hearing people in positions of power claim that you are someone who is not deserving of respect, who are claiming that you don't deserve to be who you are, express your gender in the way that you deserve to love who you wish to, that impacts how young people think about themselves. So we have seen over the course of this year, those are some of the stories that we've heard. And in terms of the impact overall, since the pandemic started, we've seen a significant increase in the number of LGBTQ youth reaching out to us. At times, it's been more than double our typical rates. And so we've been trying to put out resources, not just fighting for policies that will help LGBTQ young people, but making sure that every single LGBTQ young person in this country knows that they are beautiful the way that they are deserving of love and respect, and that they are not alone.
Before we move on to Ebony, I just wanted to note that for those of you who are watching, if you've got a good question percolating, please feel free to use the Q&A feature here in this Zoom webinar to submit your question. We'll start to curate your questions and get to those as soon as possible. We'll start weaving those in just a little bit. And I did want to make time for us to talk about the Supreme Court, if we can, a little bit about COVID-19, about the pandemic as well, if possible. But first, let's go back to where we were in our conversation. Ebony, let me get to you. And then Bambi, I think you wanted to briefly jump in afterwards. But Ebony, go ahead. What have you been hearing from your audience lately?
Sure. Well, the biggest question is, how does LGBTQ people factor into COVID-19? And when I say that, for example, we know that Black and Brown communities, unfortunately, are at a higher risk than other communities. So how do LGBTQ people factor into that? Recently, towards the beginning of the year, beginning of the pandemic, the LGBTQ Cancer Center, along with 100 other organizations, created a letter to urge public health officials, medical providers, government agencies to figure out how to bring attention to factors that might make LGBTQ people more at high risk for COVID-19. And unfortunately, there was no response to that. So we don't have that official information. We don't have the official data. However, what we do know are the things that the LGBTQ community were facing pre-pandemic. And I know, Amit, just touched on LGBTQ youth. But something we don't often talk about are things like homelessness, medical care, mental health. We know that 1 in 5 trans women will experience homelessness in their lifetime. Unfortunately, we know that LGBTQ people will turn to drugs or alcohol to self-medicate. And to be clear, when I say high risk, I mean in comparison to our non-LGBTQ counterparts. Some of this 3 times higher than our heterosexual counterparts. We also know that LGBTQ seniors, Black and Brown communities, and transgender people will face poverty or facing it right now. And right now we have people losing jobs. We're inside quarantine, so to speak. So we are losing that human interaction, that human support like LGBTQ youth really need and face. And so though we don't have the exact data, I think it's very fair that we can say the pandemic has absolutely made those numbers increase. And that's kind of the conversation that we are having right now. How can we be a part of the solution instead of being part of the problem?
Bambi, let me let you get in for a quick response and then we'll keep going.
Yeah, I think that it's important, again, that we recognize, the specific needs and issues of trans people, right, in trans communities. And let me just give a little bit of context, right? I think it's important that we recognize the position that trans people hold in 2020, even before the pandemic hit, right? We know that trans people is one of the most poor, as it was mentioned by Ebony. We know that, trans people continue to get discriminated against while trying to access employment or basic things, right? And so this was before the pandemic hit, right? And so we know for a fact that those individuals who had the privilege to have employment, for instance, right? And the type of employment that we most get is in the service industry, right? Like, doing impersonations, for instance, at bars, or some of us have the opportunity to work at restaurants or janitorial work just in the service industry, right? Or even, beauticians or makeup and that kind of stuff, right? And so almost all lost their jobs, right? So we're facing a challenge in terms of, we were already positioned within our society at the bottom of the totem pole, right? In comparison to other communities. And now we're experiencing this global pandemic that it's really setting us even further behind, right? I think it's important to also recognize that specifically for trans communities, right? It has only been in the last 5 years when we have gotten like some type of recognition, right? That, trans communities are not just being more visible, but also the violence that we continue to experience. And just an example, again, here in Los Angeles, last year when they did their homeless count, they counted about 1,000 trans and gender nonconforming people who are homeless, right? And we know that because of this global pandemic, that number is going to increase. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to support really trans lives, right? And I want to also just touch a little bit about what was being said a little while ago in terms of, these companies, right, who do have the ability to create some of those changes that need to happen in our communities. And I think it's a responsibility, right, to stand up to the government when they do crazy things. And it is up to us to really ensure that all of our communities, particularly people of color, get supported in the way they need to be supported, and especially trans people.
We're about halfway through our conversation, a little more than halfway through. Looking forward to getting some more of your questions. Let me just remind you that we are speaking to Bambi Salcedo, the president and CEO of the Trans Latina Coalition, Aaron Uritas, CEO of Out and Equal, Sarah Kate Ellis, the president and CEO of GLAAD, Alfonso David, the president of the Human Rights Campaign, Ebony Bell, owner of Tagged Magazine, and Amit Paley, the CEO and executive director of the Trevor Project. Please do drop your questions into the Q&A function of the Zoom webinar. I see some good questions are already coming in. Thank you for including your your chosen pronouns. That's helpful to me as the interviewer when I'm reading your question. Thank you for that, much appreciated. Feel free to add whatever information you think would help flesh out your question or clarify the position from which you're coming. That's most welcome, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. Let me ask about the Supreme Court before we start getting to some of your questions. And Alfonso, David, I wanted to come back to you. There have been a lot of questions about how President-elect Biden will deal with the Supreme Court now. It now is basically a 6-3 conservative majority court. 1/3 of all Supreme Court justices sitting now are appointed by Donald Trump. So this is really the Trump Supreme Court. Although it's worth noting that one of the first picks, or the first pick, Neil Gorsuch, authored the opinion that said that the Civil Rights Act protects LGBT people from discrimination in employment. So you never know sometimes the way that a justice is going to rule. There are some who have called for Joe Biden to increase the number of justices on the court, what is often pejoratively referred to as court packing. What is your sense, not just as the president of the HRC, but as a former adjunct law professor or clerk for a district court, someone who's kind of worked in the system, as to what the legal focus for LGBTQ advocacy should be going forward? Is it the Supreme Court? Is it the courts at all? Is it legislative? Is it affecting the culture? Where do you see the most urgent need to place the focus right now?
I think for LGBTQ policy, for LGBTQ people all over the country, we should not only focus on the court. We have to remember that we have administrative policy making at our disposal. We have potentially legislative levers that we can pull. Last week, the Human Rights Campaign issued a blueprint and has been shared with the Biden transition team. And that blueprint basically outlines recommendations that the Biden-Harris administration can implement without any action of Congress. We can ensure a consistent administrative interpretation of the Bostock decision. That's the case that we all know about, which said you can't discriminate against LGBTQ people. We are asking to revise restrictions on transgender individuals serving in the US military, establishing an interagency working group to address anti-transgender violence, appoint openly LGBTQ justices, establish uniform data collection efforts. So all of these things, the Biden-Harris administration, all of these steps, I should say, they could take with our Congress. So we shouldn't forget about administrative policy making. Second, we also need to remember that we have the legislature to advance LGBTQ rights. We have the House of Representatives is controlled by pro-equality candidates. We still don't know whether or not we will have a Senate that is controlled by pro-equality legislators. We will know in 2 months after the Georgia races are called. We have 2 special elections in Georgia, and I would ask that everyone get involved in the process, because if we are able to elect pro-equality candidates in the Senate, then we can advance, I believe, our #1 legislative priority, which is the Equality Act. The Equality Act would provide comprehensive protections to LGBTQ people. So some may say, well, we already have the Bostock decision. Do we need the Equality Act? Yes, we do, because in 29 states in this country, we don't have comprehensive protections for LGBTQ people. And the Equality Act would change that. Employment, housing, public accommodation, credit, education, jury service, and the list goes on. So we should not lose sight of options that we have for legislation. And then finally, Joshua, to your point on the court, yes, the court is always a focus and should always be a focus in LGBTQ rights. The courts have been very, very instructive in providing protections for LGBTQ people. And now that the court has been effectively packed by Donald Trump, we have to fight even more strategically and intentionally over the next 4 years. Of course, there is conversations about how do you change that. There are many, many factors that we're looking at when we think about court reform. And yes, it might mean changing the composition of the court, or it might mean adding more district court judges, or it might mean really thinking about immigration judges as Article 3 judges, which they're not. Right now, they're considered a part of the Department of Justice. So there are a number of different proposals that have been tossed around that I think we will talk about over the next few weeks and months. But let's not lose sight of administrative policy making and legislation as tools to advance LGBTQ rights.
We're getting some good questions in terms of what next steps might look like, what can be done from here. Welcome more of those questions. Please keep them coming. Also, if any of you watching have heard something from one of our panelists and you think I resemble that remark, feel free to share that as well. Be interested to know who we have listening and watching and what's resonating with you right now. Aaron, I think you wanted to jump in. If you would jump in briefly, and then we will keep going.
Yeah, and listen, I just want to jump in the tail of what Alfonso is saying. I want to mention that the effort that there was a huge coalition to kind of support leading up to the Supreme Court ruling. You know, what we learned was the allyship of the business community really mattered, and we can't kind of can't take for granted all the players here when we push forward to something like the Equality Act. With HRC and others, we got 200 major businesses with representing more than 7 million people and more than 5 trillion in revenue to stand up through an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, and say discrimination is bad for business. And given that the other side was pitching that they were the pro-business side, I mean, I think this sent a really, really strong message. And just to dive into that a little bit further, and I'm thinking about what Janelle said in the opening segment. You know, right now, 9 in 10 Fortune 500 companies have LGBTQ protection, and 2/3 of those actually have trans inclusive benefits. And the business case for our equality, our community's equality is largely settled business for them, and they are losing patience with the continued assaults on our equal rights and dignity, because these are their employees that they don't want to lose. And that's why, you know, you see businesses weighing in at a state level on federal bills and on these friend of the court briefs. So it's not just a moral position. It really is a business and economic argument for equality. They want to be nimble and moving people to the next big location, recruiting talent from anywhere and everywhere. And when you have whole swaths of this country that treat us differently and fail to extend equal rights for businesses, that amounts to big barriers for their nimbleness and growth. So when you see a city's most visible agencies known for rejecting LGBTQ parents from adopting, as Janelle kind of, you know, shared her concerns with Pete, or a state restricting a trans woman's access to a public restroom, businesses push back, and they will continue to do so. They're going to go find locations with laws that better align with their own values and business needs, if that is not in place. And I believe that, you know, to what Alfonso said, you know, I hope that everybody has an opportunity, you know, leading an organization that's been working for 25 years for workplace equality, that you would have the moment like I did to celebrate the Supreme Court win. But as Alfonso teed up, you know, the Equality Act is extremely important, and we need to leverage the power of business in the same way we did with the Supreme Court.
Before we get to some audience questions, Amit, could I ask you for your stance on Fulton v. City of Philadelphia, your organization's stance, Trevor Project stance on what it might mean for young people?
Happy to. So we filed with some other partner organizations, and like many of the groups I think on this call, an amicus brief arguing that discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity is not acceptable, which seems, as I say those words, and I imagine you hear them, feels like such a silly thing for me to have to state that is unacceptable. And yet that is what we and many are arguing for in the Fulton decision. And it's important not just so that adults and families that want to take in and foster and support children, that they are not the subject of discrimination, but this is also a critical issue for young people themselves. We know that young people, LGBTQ young people, are disproportionately represented in the foster care system. They need homes of people that will want to take them in. And in many cases, LGBTQ young people can be benefited by LGBTQ adults who might understand their experiences particularly well. So when we narrow and discriminate against people, preventing them from being able to support children It's not just the adults who are the victims of discrimination and the subject of discrimination, it is the young people that suffer. And I wanted to make just one broader point to some of the other comments, because we've been talking a lot about the things that are happening at the federal level. I think it is also really important that we, as a community, are watching what is happening at the state level too, because over this past year, we have seen numerous states take actions specifically targeting not just LGBTQ young people, they've specifically been targeting transgender young people. I mean, types of bills that, again, I'm about to say them, it sounds so absurd that this is happening in 2020, but there were bills that were put forward trying to prevent trans young people, specifically trans young women and trans girls, from participating in sports teams that correspond with their gender identity. And there were bills in multiple states that try to criminalize, literally criminalize a doctor's ability to provide gender affirming care for transgender and non-binary young people. That is un-American, that is wrong, that is dangerous, that puts lives in danger. And we need to make sure that we are focusing as a community on what's happening at that state level as well.
We should talk about some of the things that can be done to move forward societally and perhaps legally as we continue our conversation. We'll try to keep the answers a little bit tighter because we still have a few more topics to get through and we're starting to get some more good questions in. Again, if you have a question or a thought, something you'd like as a conversation starter or a conversation turner maybe for our panelists, please do drop it into the Q&A here in the Zoom webinar and get to as many of them as we can. Ebony, before we get back to audience questions, or get to audience questions, I wanted to ask you about this increasing and perfectly justified focus on intersectionality in the way that the many facets of who we are that make us who we are acknowledged and are irreducible in terms of the people that we are. Now we live in a nation that's going to have to deal with intersectionality because we have now had a multiracial president and we have a multiracial vice president who's about to come in. Like, you can't just separate Kamala Harris's Indian heritage from her Black heritage. She is both and you can't just let her be either or anymore. You know, that day is, the sun has set on that day, it's over. So now the country is having to deal with intersectionality in different ways. Talk about ways, particularly for people who work in corporate settings, who are like, I am scared of this word. I am just beginning to hear this word and not break into hives and cold sweats because I don't want to say the wrong thing and do the wrong thing. Talk about what you are seeing that is dealing with intersectionality right, that's dealing with it in a way that's helpful, that's thoughtful, that's manageable, that's maybe even enjoyable, especially for people in corporate environments who are just scared of getting it wrong.
Sure, it's a great question. So with companies or businesses, my first advice to you would probably be, one, do your research. Also, we are all not the same. And I say that as someone who started a publication. You know, we receive press releases and things like that. And we are specifically for LGBTQ women. But you'll be surprised how people don't realize that queer women, there are some differences than other people in our community, right? So make sure you do that research and you know who you're reaching out to, because it's great for us to celebrate things like marriage equality, some states, not enough, protecting people in the workplace, but you have to remember people who look like me, the fight is not over. You know, yes, I can get married and it's fantastic, but I still, you know, face discrimination, systematic racism all the time. And what I do appreciate is seeing organizations and companies doing a little bit more than just putting memes up on their Facebook page, but actually doing the work. And I see it happening more with the Black Lives Matter movement, that people are actually saying, how can I help? I always say, let's stop talking about it and let's be about it. This is the time to have a hands-on approach. And if you don't know what you're doing, that's okay. That's where the conversations need to happen. How do you help? Ask the people in your diversity inclusion committees. Find out, you know, how you can reach Black and brown trans people. Reach out to those organizations. I know that it can be a tough conversation to have, but it's a conversation that needs to be had. And don't be afraid to ask stupid questions.
I think it's also, Ebony, and you know, correct me if I'm wrong, and then we'll go to some audience questions. If you ask your employee for help in navigating diversity and they say, I don't feel like being your Sherpa, that's a legitimate answer. Like, it's not their job to walk you through this necessarily. We got enough to deal with just being this person that you're trying to understand, let alone helping guide you through people like us.
Sure. So I would say to that person that's saying, I don't want to deal with this, or, what have you, if you had faith in them enough to hire them, then you can absolutely support them in whatever way that you can, just like you support any other person or employee that you might have. Again, if you trust this person enough, then I think it's time that you respect and trust them as well.
Let me get to some questions, and Sarah Kate, I'll come to you with this one. I'm not expecting you to be a political scientist or a pundit or anything like this, but since you did some research in terms of how LGBTQ people voted this time, I'm interested in your perception to this question. Mark asked, how and why did Trump seem to increase his share of the LGBTQ vote this year? Again, Sarah Kate, with the proviso that I don't expect you to be a political scientist on this, but what's your perception of the change this year? Hey there, Sarah Kate, can you hear me?
I had me on mute. Apologies.
Oh, that's all right. I've done it before.
And they're out, I hear pitter patter. Anyway, we're actually out on this. We have an opinion on this. There was a poll that was reported on in the New York Times that had a margin of error of a plus or minus 7. We feel that these polls, we're not looking at apples to apples here, year over year, or 2016 to 2020, because the polling was so different, right? But what we do know is that we did do our own poll to get out there with Precision Media, which is very highly acclaimed, to find out where the LGBTQ community really stood on this. And what we found was overwhelmingly above 80% voted for Biden, voted for equality. And so we feel that a lot of these polls that are claiming to be exit polls are flawed, deeply flawed, just because we're not looking at a year over year situation over the past 4 years. And when you go into even the poll that we did prior to the election, right, where we asked people where they were going to come out, were they going for Biden or Trump? It was only, it was over 70, I think it was 79% said that they were voting for Biden Harris. And so I think when you ask the LGBTQ community and you have a large enough sample size, you can see that the community is actually very much in support of pro-equality candidates.
There's a question I'd like all the panelists to consider, and then I have a question just for Alfonso. I'm going to ask the omnibus question for everybody so you can begin thinking about it. And then Alfonso, I have a more specific legal question for you. Here's the question for everybody. Ryan asked, to all the panelists, if there was a uniform goal or commitment your organizations could make of corporate America, a goal to achieve for LGBTQ advocacy in the next 4 years of a Biden-Harris administration, what would that ask or coalition be? There is a uniform goal or commitment that you could all make of corporate America for the next 4 years of the incoming administration. What would that be for the sake of LGBTQ advocacy? Let everybody noodle on that one for a second, let it simmer. But first, Alfonso, I'm going to come to you with a question from Joey. Joey asked, is progress being made on federal laws requiring reporting of hate crime statistics? Alfonso?
Yes and no. So for the past 4 years, we have an administration that has not really enforced the law consistent with its writing, its meaning. The recent hate crimes data came out about a week ago, maybe a few days ago, I think. And the report shows that hate crimes based on sexual orientation increased. It's now 16%. And there's also been an increase for gender identity. Hate crimes is rising. It's gone from 4.2% to about 4.8%. So we're seeing a rise in hate crimes during this administration, and we're also seeing a failure to really adequately enforce the law. With respect to the state level, we're seeing some states move forward with legislation to protect people against hate crimes. Georgia recently passed a piece of legislation, but to keep in mind, that piece of legislation was not comprehensive. That piece of legislation provides protection for people with respect to hate crimes for sexual orientation, but not gender identity, which is a significant problem. So what we need to do as a community and as advocates is to make sure that we are advancing state-based legislation that protects LGBTQ people from hate crimes, both on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And with the Biden-Harris administration, I think we will have better enforcement of hate crime statutes, as well as reporting from the federal government.
Bambi, I want to come to you by way of another comment that we had. Back in last year, Bambi, you wrote the following in The Nation magazine, and I'm going to read this as you wrote it. Quote, "The so-called gay liberation movement still does not give a rat's ass about the trans movement and fails to address the violence that we trans women experience day to day as soon as we walk out of our homes, if we even have one," unquote. I wonder, Bambi, what your sense is of what LGBTQIA people could do better to provide more support to, to trans people within our own community. Maya wrote, "It would be wonderful to see more transgender leadership in government. We are seeing a slowly increasing number of out trans lawmakers at various levels across the country." Bambi, do you think that that's part of the key of it, is more trans people in positions of power? Does it come more from within the LGBTQ community? Where do you think the most change could be made right now?
Yeah, so I think, let me just say that I think we have a collective responsibility, right? Specifically to support the livelihood and the life conditions of trans people, right? Like when we're talking about the Supreme Court and the what they have approved in terms of like anti-discrimination legislation, right, that just passed through. But the truth is, and also policies, right, that organizations or companies, Fortune 500 have, that are supposed to be inclusive, right? But the truth is that legislation still happens. And what we need to do really is to empower our community, right? I'm just, so glad and happy that, this year during a global pandemic, our organization, for the first time, we learned that in the state of California, we passed a bill that is specifically to support trans lives. Assembly Bill 2218, which is the Transgender Wellness and Equity Fund, which was crafted, designed, implemented, mobilized all the way to the governor's desk, and he signed this law, right? And it is through community empowerment that this happened. And I think if those of us who do have the ability and the power to create those changes, to be not just inclusive, but to really support trans leadership and to support the changes that need to happen to better the quality of life of our community, I believe that we can do it, right? We just need to be intentional about doing it and really, just mean what we say and say what we mean, not just say it from the lips up, but rather from, just being intentional and really support our community to be at a better place within our society.
I hear that. And I totally hear you, Bambi, in terms of just, it's amazing the difference that being intentional can make, of just being mindful of what you might not be mindful of, being mindful that you might have a blind spot, or being mindful that there might be something more you can do. It's kind of amazing what happens once you just kind of open your mind to the possibility that more needs to happen. We are getting limited in what we can make happen in this conversation because we are low on time, but I did want to work my way around and give folks a chance to answer that big question in terms of a uniform commitment that you would make, or you would ask of corporate America to advance LGBTQ advocacy in this upcoming administration. Sarah Kate, if I may start with you, partly because of the nature of the way that corporations support LGBTQ people, Ann Northrop, who is the organizer of the Queer Liberation March, wrote last year for NBC News Think that pride parades like New York's parade have become what she called corporate pardons. So I know that there's some touchiness in terms of the way that corporations telegraph their support for LGBTQIA people. Of course, our company, Comcast NBC Universal, supports pride parades and has initiatives like this DEI program. But Sarah, let me start with you briefly, and then we'll work our way around. What commitment would you ask corporate America to make over the next at least 4 years?
I would say overall, continue to be our partner, that there is going to be a number of things that come up from the Equality Act to Supreme Court decisions that we're going to need your support on. And then, of course, for those who are multinational, globally, we're still trying to decriminalize being LGBTQ in over 70 countries around the world. So I think continuing to be a partner, building on that partner. And I think the way to avoid corporate parades, if you will, is to do the work internally, to make sure that you're doing the work internally and also supporting externally, not just during Pride Month and not just with a parade. And I think a lot of the companies on this call do that really well. And Out and Equal is a great partner in that as well. And we work with a lot through our GLAAD Media Institute. So I say continue to partner with us, ante up, use the UN standards, especially for acting in the public sphere. It's very helpful for us.
Amit, Paley, could I ask you, what would your ask be, particularly on behalf of the young people that the Trevor Project supports?
Yeah, there's so many. I might just boil down to 3 that I would highlight. I think one would be to make sure that you are pushing lawmakers at all levels, not just at the federal level and not just in some states, but all states, to make sure that they are preventing discrimination and ensuring equal treatment for all people, especially young people, on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. The second that I would say is that there are proactive steps that are being taken specifically to support young people and prevent harm from being caused to them. We haven't talked that much on this call about conversion therapy, but young people on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity are still effectively being tortured and trying to be told that who they are is wrong, that they can change, which we know is not true. It's still legal in 30 states to be advocating on the state level to ban conversion therapy from being inflicted on minors by medical and clinical providers. And then the third thing I would say is a little bit less around policy, but I think is also really important. And that is to make sure that both you as an organization, individuals who make up that organization, and how you interact with people are pushing for acceptance. Trevor Project research shows that having just one accepting adult in an LGBTQ young person's life can reduce their risk of suicide by 40%. 40%. And so I want to encourage everyone listening to this, you can be that one person. You can be that one person who can both send support and acceptance, who can encourage others to do that. And in doing so, you can help save the lives of more LGBTQ youth.
I'm going to let Erin go last because I want to give her a chance to do any last minute housekeeping before we wrap up the event. So I'm going to ask Erin to hold on 1 second. Let me come to Alfonso. What's your one big ask?
My one big ask is, well, there are 2. Sorry, I'll do it quickly. One, first, I want to just say to all the companies that participate in the Corporate Equality Index, which is HRC's index for establishing inclusive workspaces. Thank you for doing that. We have more than 1,000 businesses that participate now. Please continue to participate in the Corporate Equality Index. But in terms of my 2 asks, one would be define and or refine your values. There are so many businesses that was struck with how they would respond to Black Lives Matter and racial injustice and the protests over the summer. And that challenge they faced because they hadn't really refined their values. So first, please refine your values. It will give you guidance in determining how to respond to issues that are in the public sphere. Second, I would say, to the extent possible, engage with us as you are now, but even more so when we engage with the administration, the Supreme Court, and others on policy development. When we are fighting for LGBTQ rights and businesses are there to support us, it changes the narrative. And I would ask more and more business to do that with us because we can then actually change the landscape.
Ebony?
Mine is actually going to be quick and simple because it's exactly what Alfonso mentioned, which is the HRC Equality Index. If you haven't heard of it, I definitely would say take some time to check it out and research it. Even if you don't submit your company to go in it, I think it's a great tool for you to figure out how you can be supportive of not only LGBTQ employees, but the community as a whole. It grades things on how many LGBTQ employees do you have, the type of benefits you have for them, how many people, transgender people are on your staff. Even if you don't apply, I would definitely say this is a great opportunity for you to start somewhere.
Bambi.
I would say that just for all of us, right? Those of you who are watching and all of us who are here, I think, I believe that we can all shape a better world for all of us, including trans people, right? And I think we have a responsibility to also hold elected officials accountable, right, for what they need to do when they are in office. And I think it's an opportunity for us to understand our individual and our collective power and not let others behind, right, as we have done in the past. Trans people are about 40 years behind in comparison to the gay and lesbian community because we were left behind. So right now it's an opportunity for us to, all of us, bring us up to the forefront and really create the changes that will happen for all of us to be at a better place within our society.
And before we wrap up, Erin.
Thank you so much, Joshua. I don't want to repeat, there's so many good ideas thrown out there, but let me just tee up two things. We have a unique angle in that we work from the C-suite and CEOs to support them in their advocacy and standing up for our community, but we also support ERGs, the employee resource groups, LGBTQ groups within organizations that have often been the unsung heroes of driving change up. And so what I would say is that, especially in this year when we are, organizations are really being crushed with mental health issues, frankly, and the workforce that the kids that are coming out of, for example, working with Trevor Project are entering the workforce. And with the pandemic, the election, a lot of stress, and kind of suffering under this administration, workforces are having to look at creative ways to approach mental health. They need to leverage the intersectionality and the power of these employee resource groups so that we can effectively address these challenges. So, and I think we've made a lot of progress here, but I think moving, with the indices that we have, the CEI is phenomenal. We have a lot of people doing great work to help set good policy. And the blueprint, by the way, congratulations, Alfonso, on that. We also need a playbook. And I think that the network that we work with the large kind of swath of companies working together, people are turning to each other and asking how, in our local kind of business context or cultural context, how do we actually make that happen? And I think that all of us on this call and many, many others in the movement working together, we're going to be able to pull all these levers for transformational change for our community.
Any last minute housekeeping you want to do, Erin, before I wrap it up?
Just really to thank you, Joshua, for hosting, Yvette Miley, our incredible board member. And listen, many of you know I spent all 8 years of the Obama administration, what some of us call the golden years, out of the country. And I came back with my 2 daughters just a few months before Trump was elected. And so many of you have been in the movement leading us for so long. And I am always honored and humbled to be amongst you, and really thank you for your work.
Did want to acknowledge those of you who asked questions. Apologies to Brian and Christopher and Ryan and Sasha that I wasn't able to get to your comments, but thank you for sharing them. I will finish with my ask, not just to corporate America, but to everybody. And this is my bias as a journalist and an interviewer. There's been a lot said about asking questions, about trying to start that conversation. Do me a favor. If you ask, listen. And if you listen, learn. And if you learn better, do better. Do not make this an academic exercise. The lives of LGBTQIA people are fascinating, but we are not a fascination. We're not a curiosity. We're real. And one of the things we're trying to do at NBC News is depict the lives of all kinds of people in real and meaningful and profound ways, because we're fascinating. But we also have some very serious issues that need addressing. Whether you can solve the problem is not your responsibility. It's not up to you to solve these problems. It's up to you first to understand them and then figure out where you can plug in. So the courage to ask the question is amazing. But if you ask, listen. If you listen, try to learn. And if you learn better, do better. Thanks to you for watching today's webinar. Thanks also to Amit Paley, Ebony Bell, Alfonso David, Bambi Salcedo, Aaron Uritis, and Sarah Kate Ellis. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson from NBC News. Thanks for watching. Take care.
Thank you.